This video is sponsored by Art the Trek, trip planning software for your next trip. Man, do I make mistakes, and I made a ton of mistakes on my last backpacking trip. Check it out, it's here in the cards where I was going to go to the Smokies, ended up in Cumberland Gap National Park. But as you have time to sit back on and reflect on trips, I don't know about you guys, but what I end up doing is I try to think back to what I could have done differently or better, especially on trips like this where things don't go according to plan, or I think to myself, man, I really could have done X, Y, or Z. But here are some mistakes that I made on that trip and how I kind of avoided disaster or how I fixed them. The first big one has got to be shoe choice. And I actually balanced this quite a bit and tossed around the idea in my head. Was I going to bring the Salomon Speedcross 4s, which are lightweight, I can definitely move a lot faster, but they're not waterproof, but they do dry, versus the Salomon X Ultras. I actually had both of those pairs of shoes sitting by the front door, and I'm making a choice between which one do I carry. The Salomon X Ultras in my head, I'm like, oh, that's a little bit heavier. I know I'm going to move slower with those, but it has the potential to keep your feet drier. I opted for the Speedcross 4s, which worked okay because of how I fixed my mistake. But if I'm being honest with myself, the X Ultras would have been a much better choice. There were no major crossings. It was just constantly trudging through snow, which got my feet soaked and it got my feet cold. How I managed to fix that is the hack that you guys have all seen by now, where I was smart enough to bring plastic bags, kind of bread bags or grocery bags. And so what I did when I got into camp is I changed my socks right away, dried my feet off, put fresh socks on, put the bag over my sock, and then put them back in my shoes. That way it kept my feet dry and it warmed up immediately. And so thankfully that's one of those hacks that's really easy to bring. Bread bags or grocery bags weigh almost nothing, and if anything you can use them as a trash bag. And so that's one way that I fixed my mistake. But shoe choice was a big no-no. I should have brought the X Ultras. So number 2 would be camping as close as I did near water and kind of down in this hollow. And I knew those are two things that definitely means condensation. In the summer and the winter time, it tends to mean a lot of frost. And so I had condensation all over the inside of my tarp. I had condensation all over my backpack. I'll put a picture here if I get it from my Instagram. But it was definitely colder than I thought and a lot more condensation because of my campsite location. Now this is one that I knew the potential problems before going to bed. And so what I tried to do as much as possible is to keep my quilt and whatever else I had off the sides of the hammock as much as I could, kept it on the pad. The nice thing about my Enigma is that the outside is 20D, so it's kind of a little bit more weather resistant, and so I don't worry about it getting wet as much. You still have to be careful with it, but it's not something I had to worry about a whole lot. A recurring theme for me, it seems, is not bringing a topographical map. Now this one was not my fault. But I think it's really important to emphasize how important it is to have a topographical map. I didn't have any idea about actual elevation gain in terms of planning that trip because the trip ended up the way it did. I was supposed to go to the Smokies, didn't really work out. But the big way I fixed it is, you guys saw it clipped on me. I had the Garmin inReach, and so I had a topographical map. It just wasn't in the plans. I kind of had just to rely on it, read what was on the screen. And so it worked out and I fixed that problem that way. But it would have been nice in terms of if the trip were planned to have a topographical map. And even when I went to the visitor center, I actually asked for a topographical map, but you know, those visitor center maps are typically just trail maps overall, some mileage stuff on there. I just had to get some idea of elevation gain from the nice park employee. So it worked out, but mostly because I had my GPS to kind of make sure that I could see elevation changes and gain. Being surprised by snow at higher altitudes. This is one of those things that you should know, and I knew going into it that, hey, it's going to be higher, it's going to be up there, you're going to have potential snow. I was surprised by exactly how much snow there was. I won't lie, it's something that really took me aback by just how much was up there, because when you started down lower, you have, of course, I mean, it was perfect fall weather, perfect fall temperatures, but of course, the higher you got, and honestly, I knew it was about 3,000 feet. I didn't expect snow being that low down. But there was, how I fixed this problem is that I planned for the snow anyway. So even though it surprised me, I did some things that meant that I would still be warm. So I brought a 20-degree quilt, even though it technically wasn't calling for that on the weather, because I knew you never know as you get higher how cold the place will be. I brought those bags for my shoes that you saw. I brought more clothes than I thought was necessary. I honestly thought when I was packing for this trip, and you guys have seen the loadout video, I thought it was overkill. I was thinking to myself, this is not going to be an issue. It's going to be overkill for what I'm actually going to be experiencing. And I'm glad I over-prepared. That's one of those cases where it worked out for me. Oh, the big one for me, and it hurts me to say, is a little bit of arrogance. I overestimated my speed, especially through the snow. I overestimated the amount of miles I was going to cover on certain days. And so sometimes I think it's important as backpackers, hikers, to take a little bit of humble pie. And in some cases, it is okay to over prepare, and it's also okay to have a realistic feel for your own skills, especially if things like the weather changes or the conditions are different than you anticipated. Another big underestimation I made was not realizing how quickly we would lose the light. And that's one of the reasons why I try not to go a whole lot of backpacking past daylight savings times, because you run out of light, and you tend to do camp chores and go to bed even quicker than I feel like during the summer months or the other 3 seasons. But light went down even faster, not only because it was wintertime, but because we were down in that hollow, and so the sun kind of went over the ridge, and once it went over the ridge, boom, temperature dropped, light dropped, and we had nighttime. How did I fix this? Is you guys saw it. I recognize what was happening with the light as well as the temperature, and I didn't want a night hike. And I tried to take a realistic accounting of what I felt like doing, what I knew I could do, and I recognized that I should stop. And stopping earlier was the biggest thing I did. And sometimes I think it's difficult to kind of admit that. For people who have tapped out of trips before, it's difficult to admit that, you know what, I'm not having fun, this thing isn't going how I wanted it to. So tapping out is an option. I mean, you don't have to stay. And so that's one of the things I'm glad I did, is I stopped earlier than I anticipated, and I made a decision that, nope, I have to set up camp and kind of get warm. You guys ever have a trip like that where it seems like everything goes wrong? Let me know what you learned from those mistakes. I think all of us are continually learning, developing, growing, and we make mistakes. If you're not making mistakes, you're not learning, is what I always tell my own kids. And so let me know what you have learned from your mistakes. I really want to kind of learn from them as well. And so like I mentioned before, this video is sponsored by Art of the Trek, and this actually would have come in super handy on my most recent trip. I was planning on going to the Smokies and planning on using this trip planning tool and software to kind of get things going. And it would have solved a lot of issues for me. The first one, of course, is gear list, making sure I have exactly what I needed. Campsite selection would have been a huge one as well that I would have had availability to. Real end, the eventual build is supposed to have user reports as well, making sure that I know accurate information. Estimating hiking speed is a big one, as well as making sure I have accurate, up-to-date weather information, something you're building into the app. And of course, topographical maps, knowing exactly what elevation I'm gaining or losing, and being prepared for that is huge. Of course, they're building this stuff out right now, and they're a small company, they're kind of getting off the ground, and something I want to make sure that you guys are aware of, and thank you to those of you guys who have gone and used this link before. It is www.artofthetrek.com/prioritize-me. If you go ahead and use that link, it's in the description, and I'll pin a comment here as well. It'll really allow them to have a good head start on making sure that they know exactly what areas need to be mapped and which ones are the most popular. As always, thanks again for watching, guys. Peace.